Hi, everyone. I want to teach you about the Justinian plague today using a great article from one of my favorite magazines, Ancient History. It's a magazine I have a subscription to where I get a lot of my knowledge from. Uh, and this one's called In Search of Salvation, Praying Away the Plague. And right before we get into it, a quick kind of information about it is the plague started way over here in China, that much we know, traveled down to Egypt along old Silk Road trade routes, and then before too long, all the way up to Constantinople, and from there spread throughout the Justinian Byzantine Empire. So here we go. Read along with me. Have the article open. Praying Away the Plague. In AD 541, a deadly plague broke out in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium. Spreading through the Byzantine Empire and from there across Europe, it took millions of lives and shook society. To the people living through it, this was an event of apocalyptic proportions. They turned to religion to help them through. Recent genetic research has found that the Justinian plague started in China. It arrived in Egypt in AD 541. Because of the Byzantine Empire's reliance on Egyptian grain, the disease quickly reached the heart of the empire. By 542, it had struck Constantinople. From there, it was spread by war and trade across Europe and the Middle East, or otherwise known as Southwest Asia, this whole region over here. Victims of the disease suffered from fevers, nightmares, delusions, and swellings. Their screams of madness and pain haunted those around them, with hundreds, even thousands dying every day, bodies piled up in the streets. Not just humans, but also animals they lived alongside. As graveyards ran out of space, bodies were disposed of at sea or in hastily dug pits. The disease is now recognized as bubonic plague, spread by black rats. Some people also call this the Black Death. As on other occasions, it was probably accompanied by pneumonic and septicemic plague. Pneumonic would be revolving like fluid in the lungs, septicemic would be blood. It recurred throughout the following centuries, wiping out millions of people across Europe. Exact figures are impossible to come by. Procopius's assertion that the plague affected the entire world is exaggerated, but understandable. From Britain to Palestine, the world of the Byzantines was engulfed in this terrible disease. So what we just learned here was that this was a pandemic that struck this entire region. We know from sources that it was all the way up here in Ireland, down here to Spain, Northern Africa, all through here to Palestine, over here where Jerusalem is, and the rest. We're having emerging evidence that it was even striking up here in Germania. Reading along. The plague is named after the Emperor Justinian, who survived its arrival in his empire. But while the emperor persevered, his position was weakened. The Byzantine Empire was made weaker by the population loss from the plague. This prevented it from reasserting its dominance in Italy to the west and against Arab raiders to the east. Many students have often asked, why didn't Justinian just conquer the whole thing, take it all over? Here we probably have our reason that the plague had killed so many millions of people. He just didn't have the soldiers to do it, even though his reign went on for 20 years past this plague. Reading on. The plague and faith. All the chroniclers of the era attributed the plague to God's will, and it was to God that many people turned for protection. A rise in donation to churches and in people entering monasteries reflected the desperate search for divine protection. Gregory of Tours records a religious procession around Reims to protect that city from the disease. Most people could not afford the services of a trained physician. The cures they instead turned to had a strong religious feel. Powders, supposedly blessed by saints, were applied alongside magical amulets and rings. Prayer played a huge part. The plague even affected the shape of the church. High mortality rates in Britain paved the way for monastic influences from Ireland. That means a lot of people were dying in Britain, so many early Christians and Catholics were coming over to Britain from Ireland. Constantinople's inability to regain control of Italy influenced the growing schism between the Eastern and Western faiths. That's something we're going to learn about later. So I think this article is important for us to understand because right now during the COVID crisis that we're going through, it does seem like there are a lot of people saying this has never happened before and this is unprecedented. Unprecedented meaning this has never happened before. We in history know that Pandemics have struck the planet many, 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 many times. In fact, we're very lucky with the current COVID crisis because it's not killing nearly as many people as past pandemics have. But if we go back in time to the year 541 and 542, this Justinian plague, it was a big deal to them, and to those people, this was the first time it had ever happened, and it was something that they just didn't know how to cope with. And they also didn't have the science to know about staying apart from each other and not coughing and breathing on each other, or just not sitting next to one another. Today, we have the knowledge, even though this disease and that one are quite different from one another. Just to wrap up, this plague didn't just go away. It stuck around for another almost 200 years in this entire region behind me here. And it came back about every 20 years, again, killing another few million people, which is horrible to think of. But when we learn about the Middle Ages, we're going to revisit the idea of the Black Plague. But something that always kind of blows my mind is that each of us, regardless of what our ethnic heritage is, each of us is here because we have ancestors that lived through this kind of stuff. And to me, that is just something that it makes history so interesting, but also heartbreaking, but makes me want to learn more. All right, my friends, I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.